The moon had disappeared behind thick cloud cover at exactly 2300 hours on the night of October 14, 1944, leaving the Hurtgen forest in darkness so complete that Staff Sergeant Robert Muller could not see his own hand when he held it 6 inches from his face. Behind him, 150 men from the 28th Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion waited in a column formation that stretched back 300 yards through trees that had been shredded by weeks of artillery fire. Ahead, approximately 400 yards of open ground separated American lines from the German pillboxes that anchored the Siegfried Line's western defences. The ground between those positions was mined. Intelligence reports suggested a density of 1 anti-personnel mine per square yard, supplemented by larger anti-tank devices positioned to destroy any armoured support. Standard doctrine said, you cleared minefields with engineers using metal detectors and prodding rods, working methodically in daylight with artillery suppression covering your advance. You did not send infantry through mine-dense terrain in total darkness, using only the navigational instincts of a 20-year-old farm kid from Iowa who had never seen combat before September. But Captain James Henderson had run out of conventional options 3 hours earlier when German machine gun fire had pinned down his company's daytime assault, killing 2 engineer teams before they could establish breach lanes through the defensive barrier. The attack had to continue tonight. Division headquarters had made that clear. The Hurtgen offensive depended on capturing the high ground beyond those pillboxes before German reinforcements arrived from the east. Delay meant failure, and failure meant the entire 28th Division's assault would stall against defenses that had already consumed 3 American infantry regiments. Henderson had been studying his options when Private First Class Thomas Decker volunteered for a mission that every tactical manual said was suicide. The captain knew Decker only from personnel files and brief encounters during the company's October training rotations. A farm kid from rural Iowa who had grown up walking his family's fields in darkness, guiding livestock through pastures marked only by fence posts he had memorized during childhood. The boy claimed he could navigate by feel, reading terrain through the soles of his boots, while using techniques that had no name in military doctrine, but had been passed down through generations of Midwest farmers who worked land they knew better than their own homes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were brutal but simple. 150 soldiers needed to cross 400 yards of mined ground in complete darkness, maintaining formation discipline while avoiding detection by German sentries equipped with flares and automatic weapons. A single mine detonation would alert the enemy, bringing down artillery fire that would slaughter men trapped in open terrain with no cover. One wrong step by the lead navigator would kill dozens before the column could react. Standard mine density calculations suggested they would trigger approximately 40 anti-personnel devices during any conventional crossing attempt, even with trained combat engineers leading the way. Decker claimed he could reduce that number to 0, not through technical expertise or specialized equipment, but through an agricultural skill set that had nothing to do with military training. The ability to read disturbed earth through subtle changes in ground resistance, to detect the slight depressions that marked mine placement, to navigate using spatial memory that functioned independently of visual input, skills that seemed almost supernatural to soldiers who had grown up in cities where darkness meant streetlights and navigation meant reading signs. Henderson had approved the mission with the grim awareness that he was gambling 150 lives on the navigational abilities of a teenager whose only qualification was growing up on a farm. But conventional tactics had failed throughout the afternoon, and the division's timetable allowed no flexibility for extended delays. The Hurtgen forest had already demonstrated that textbook solutions did not work against German defenses designed by engineers who understood that Americans relied too heavily on technological advantages and standardized procedures. Decker stood at the head of the column now, feeling the ground beneath his boots with the concentration that had once allowed him to guide dairy cattle through Iowa pastures on moonless nights when his father's generator had failed. The texture told him everything. Undisturbed forest soil had a specific density, a resistance pattern that he had learned to recognize through thousands of hours walking fields, where one wrong step could mean a broken ankle in a groundhog hole or worse, injuries from farm equipment hidden by tall grass. Mined ground felt different. The disturbance created when engineers buried explosive devices left signatures that persisted for weeks. Slight depressions where soil had been excavated and replaced. Changes in compaction that altered how the earth responded to weight. Even the way pine needles settled over disturbed areas created patterns that could be detected through careful observation, though observation in this context meant touch rather than sight. He had explained this to Captain Henderson 3 hours earlier, watching skepticism war with desperation on the officer's face. The captain had asked reasonable questions about reliability and verification, about what happened if Decker's agricultural instincts proved wrong in a military context where mistakes meant casualties. The private first class had answered honestly. He could not guarantee success, could not provide the kind of statistical confidence that staff officers preferred when evaluating tactical options. He could only offer skills that had never failed him during 20 years of navigating Iowa farmland in conditions that ranged from complete darkness to blinding snow. The German defensive positions were quiet now, their machine guns silent after the afternoon's engagement had ended with American withdrawal and German celebration of another successful defense. Sentries would be alert but not actively scanning, their attention focused on likely avenues of approach rather than the minefield that supposedly provided absolute security against infantry infiltration. The psychological advantage of defensive obstacles was often greater than their physical barrier effect. Minefields did not have to kill attackers to be effective. They only needed to create fear that paralyzed initiative and forced predictable responses. Decker took his first step into the minefield at 23:15 hours, moving with deliberate slowness that allowed his boot to compress soil gradually, while his mind processed feedback through nerve endings that had been trained by years of practical experience. The ground felt wrong immediately. A subtle difference in resistance that suggested recent disturbance, approximately 8 inches below the surface. He shifted his weight backward, withdrawing his foot before it could trigger whatever device lay buried in that location. Behind him, Sergeant William Crawford watched with the intensity of a man whose life depended on Decker's agricultural expertise. Crawford was a combat veteran who had seen action in North Africa and Sicily, a professional soldier who understood that survival often depended on adapting to circumstances that no training manual had anticipated. He had been skeptical when Henderson had explained the navigation plan, but skepticism was a luxury that soldiers could not afford when conventional options had been exhausted. The column waited in silence, while Decker searched for safe passage through terrain that looked identical to trained infantry eyes, but revealed itself to agricultural instincts that operated on completely different principles. He moved laterally 3 feet, testing the ground with the same careful pressure farmers used when evaluating whether fields were dry enough for planting or still too saturated to support tractor weight. The soil here felt more natural, its compression pattern consistent with undisturbed forest floor rather than excavated earth that had been replaced after mine installation. He took another step, then another, building a mental map of safe routes through the defensive barrier, using spatial memory that functioned like the internal navigation systems farmers developed after years of working the same fields in all weather conditions. Each footfall added data to the accumulated pattern, creating a path that existed only in Decker's mind, but would have to be communicated to the 149 men following behind him through complete darkness. The communication method was primitive but effective. A thin rope connected Decker to Sergeant Crawford, who followed exactly in the farm kid's footsteps, while maintaining the physical link that would guide subsequent soldiers through the established safe lane. Each man would step precisely where the man ahead of him had stepped, trusting that Decker's navigation had identified the only path through the minefield that would not trigger devices designed to maim and kill. 20 minutes into the crossing, Decker had advanced 30 yards, establishing a route that zigzagged through the defensive barrier with turns that seemed random to soldiers who could not see the subtle terrain features that dictated each change in direction. The pace was agonizingly slow, but speed would have been fatal. Each footfall required complete concentration. Each decision point demanded absolute certainty before committing weight to ground that might conceal explosive devices, capable of severing limbs or worse. The first crisis came at the 40-yard mark, when Decker detected a pattern of disturbance that extended across the entire width of his planned route. German engineers had apparently created a continuous barrier of mines at this depth, anticipating that American forces might attempt infiltration through the defensive belt. Standard mine-clearing doctrine would have required engineers to probe this area systematically, marking safe lanes with white tape before allowing infantry to advance. Decker had no tape, no probing rods, and no engineering equipment beyond his boots and the agricultural instincts that allowed him to read soil composition through pressure and resistance. He moved laterally along the mine barrier, searching for weak points or gaps that might indicate oversight in German defensive planning. 20 feet to his left, he found what he was looking for: a section where natural drainage had apparently prevented effective mine placement, creating a narrow corridor where water flow had kept soil too saturated for stable burial of explosive devices. The gap was barely 18 inches wide, requiring each soldier to move through in single file with precision that would test discipline and nerve. But it was passable, and passable was all that mattered when the alternative was triggering mines that would alert German defenses and bring down artillery fire on the entire column. Decker led the rope through the gap, feeling Crawford's tension transmitted through the physical link as the sergeant realized how narrow their margin for error had become. Behind Crawford, 148 men waited in darkness so complete that they could not see the soldiers directly ahead of them. The column had been briefed on procedures, told to follow the rope with absolute precision, warned that deviation of even inches could mean stepping on mines that would kill them and compromise the entire mission. But understanding procedures intellectually was different from executing them in combat conditions where fear and physical exhaustion degraded performance in ways that training could not fully anticipate. Private Robert Hensley was 19th in the column, a position that meant he could hear occasional whispered instructions from soldiers ahead, but received no direct communication from the lead navigator, who was determining their path through the minefield. He had grown up in Philadelphia, where darkness meant city lights and navigation meant street signs. The concept of reading terrain through boot soles seemed like rural mysticism to someone whose only experience with soil involved grass lawns maintained by municipal workers. But Hensley had seen what happened to infantry who questioned tactical decisions in combat. You followed orders, trusted your leaders, and dealt with consequences as they developed. Decker might be navigating through agricultural instinct rather than military training, but the farm kid had gotten them this far without triggering mines that would have killed dozens. That track record was more convincing than any technical explanation of methodology. The crossing continued with mechanical precision, each soldier moving through the narrow gap that Decker had identified, then following the rope as it led deeper into the minefield toward objectives that remained invisible in the October darkness. German sentries in the pillboxes ahead showed no signs of detecting the American infiltration, their attention focused on likely assault routes rather than terrain they believed was secured by mines that prevented infantry penetration. At the 100-yard mark, Decker encountered another barrier, this one marked by disturbed earth patterns that suggested extensive German engineering work. The defensive belt was not uniform, but layered, with multiple mine lines positioned to create redundant barriers that would stop American forces, even if the first obstacles were somehow breached. Intelligence reports had not mentioned this level of defensive preparation, but intelligence reports often reflected what analysts wanted to believe rather than actual enemy capabilities. He worked laterally again, searching for gaps or weak points, while maintaining the slow, methodical pace that had sustained their progress through the previous hour. Each minute increased the risk of German detection, but rushing would guarantee mine detonations that would alert every sentry within earshot. The balance between speed and safety was calculated in fractions of seconds, decisions that Decker made through instinct rather than conscious analysis. The gap this time was smaller, barely 12 inches wide and marked by a slight elevation change that would require soldiers to step up onto a natural ridge before descending on the opposite side. The maneuver was awkward in daylight and potentially fatal in darkness, but again it was passable, and passable meant mission success, in circumstances where failure would mean division-level consequences rippling through the entire Hurtgen offensive. Decker led the rope through the second barrier, feeling the increased tension as soldiers behind him realized they were climbing over obstacles in complete darkness while surrounded by mines that could detonate from misplaced weight. The farm kid's agricultural background had prepared him for this kind of spatial navigation, but city soldiers who had never walked anywhere without visual reference points were operating entirely on faith and discipline. The psychological pressure was building throughout the column as realization set in that they had now penetrated deep enough into the minefield that retreat would be as dangerous as continuing forward. They were committed to Decca's navigation, trusting that agricultural skills would translate to military survival in circumstances that would have seemed impossible during training exercises conducted in daylight with engineer support. At the 150-yard mark, halfway through the minefield crossing, Decca paused to assess conditions ahead. The cloud cover that had provided concealment was beginning to break up, allowing occasional moonlight that would improve visibility but also increase the risk of German detection. The tactical situation was shifting in ways that created new variables, requiring decisions that fell outside the parameters Henderson had briefed during mission planning. Standard infantry doctrine said you adapted to changing conditions, modified plans based on actual circumstances rather than theoretical assumptions. But Decca's navigation system depended on darkness, on the sensory focus that came from eliminating visual input and relying entirely on touch and spatial memory. Moonlight would disrupt that concentration, introducing visual data that might conflict with the tactile information he had been using to guide their path. He made his decision with the confidence that came from 20 years of practical experience. They would continue using the same navigational methodology regardless of visibility conditions, trusting agricultural instincts over visual observation that might reveal features that looked dangerous but felt safe when evaluated through proper assessment techniques. The boots would guide them, just as they had guided livestock and farm equipment through Iowa fields, where one wrong step could mean economic disaster for families that depended on agricultural success for survival. The column resumed movement, soldiers following the rope with discipline that would have impressed parade ground inspectors, maintaining formation through complete darkness, while surrounded by explosives designed to inflict maximum casualties on infantry trapped in open ground. The commitment to the mission was absolute now, powered by momentum and the realization that they had come too far to turn back, that Decca's navigation had proven reliable enough to justify continued faith in methods that seemed to violate everything military training taught about mine warfare. By the 200-yard mark, the rope connecting Decca to Sergeant Crawford had become more than a physical link between soldiers. It represented the accumulated trust of 150 men who had committed their lives to agricultural expertise that operated outside conventional military frameworks. Each tug on the rope transmitted information about pace and direction changes, creating a primitive but effective communication system that functioned despite the silence discipline required for successful infiltration. Crawford had stopped questioning Decca's methodology after the first successful navigation through the initial mine barrier. The sergeant's combat experience had taught him to recognize competence, regardless of its source, and the farm kid's performance demonstrated a level of skill that transcended formal training. Agricultural instincts were proving more reliable than engineering equipment in circumstances where technological solutions had failed throughout the afternoon's conventional assault. The third major mine barrier appeared at the 220-yard mark, marked by disturbance patterns that suggested German engineers had concentrated their defensive efforts at predictable infiltration depths. Decca recognized the tactical logic immediately. Defensive planners assumed that American forces would attempt to breach the minefield at its weakest points, creating concentrated obstacles at locations where attackers were most likely to commit their efforts. But Decca was not thinking like a military planner. His agricultural background had taught him to look for natural features that dictated practical solutions rather than theoretical optimal approaches. Water drainage, soil, composition, vegetation patterns – these were the factors that determined where mines could be effectively placed and where German engineers would have encountered installation difficulties that created exploitable gaps. He found the weakness 15 feet to his right, where a slight depression had apparently collected water during recent rains, creating saturated conditions that prevented stable mine burial. The gap was narrow, barely 2 feet wide, but it extended through the entire depth of the defensive barrier. German engineers had probably recognized the vulnerability but lacked resources to address every weakness in a minefield that extended for miles along the Siegfried Line's western approaches. Decker led the column through the gap with the same careful precision that had characterized the entire crossing, each footfall deliberate, each decision verified through tactile assessment before committing weight to ground that might conceal explosive devices. The soldiers following, behind him, had developed their own rhythm now, moving with confidence born from successful navigation through obstacles that should have been impassable under current conditions. Private Hensley, still 19th in the column, had stopped questioning the methodology that was keeping them alive. His Philadelphia upbringing had not prepared him for this kind of navigation, but results spoke louder than theoretical objections. Decker's agricultural expertise was functioning exactly as promised, identifying safe passage through terrain that would have killed conventionally trained soldiers who relied on visual observation and technical equipment. The cloud cover broke completely at the 250-yard mark, flooding the minefield with moonlight that revealed the full scope of their situation. Hensley could now see the disturbed earth patterns that marked mine placements, the careful German engineering that had created a defensive barrier designed to channel American forces into predetermined killing zones. He could also see how narrow their safe corridor actually was, how precise Decker's navigation had been in threading them through gaps that were barely wide enough for single-file passage. The visibility created new psychological pressure. Soldiers who had been operating on faith could now see the dangers they were navigating through, could observe how close they were coming to mines that would have shredded anyone who deviated even inches from Decker's established path. Knowledge that had been abstract during darkness became concrete under moonlight, testing nerves in ways that blindness had not. But visibility also revealed something the Americans had not anticipated. German sentries in the forward pillboxes were looking in the wrong direction, their attention focused on approaches they expected American forces to use, rather than the minefield that supposedly provided absolute security. The psychological effect of defensive obstacles was working against the defenders now, creating complacency born from over-reliance on technical solutions rather than active observation. Decker increased his pace slightly, recognizing that moonlight reduced the advantage of his navigational methodology while increasing the risk of German detection. The agricultural skills that functioned perfectly in darkness were less critical when soldiers could see terrain features for themselves. But the path through the remaining mine barriers still required expertise that came from experience rather than observation, the ability to distinguish between ground that looked safe and ground that actually was safe. At the 300-yard mark, with only 100 yards remaining before they reached German defensive positions, the column encountered their most serious obstacle yet, a continuous barrier of mines that extended across the entire width of their approach route, with no obvious gaps or weaknesses that Decker could exploit through lateral movement. German engineers had apparently concentrated maximum effort at this final defensive layer, anticipating that American forces who somehow penetrated the outer mine belts would be stopped by overwhelming density at the last critical distance. Decker knelt at the edge of the barrier, feeling the ground with his hands rather than his boots, searching for any variation in soil composition that might indicate safe passage. The disturbance patterns were extensive and uniform, suggesting professional installation by experienced engineers who understood that defensive barriers were only effective if they prevented circumvention through gaps or weak points. Standard doctrine said this situation required combat engineers with mine detectors and explosive charges to create breach lanes through prepared defenses. But Decker had neither equipment nor time, and the mission depended on maintaining silence that would be compromised the moment they attempted conventional mine clearing operations. He needed to find a solution that relied on agricultural expertise rather than military technology, a weakness in German defensive planning that could be exploited through unconventional assessment methodologies. The answer came from remembering his father's instructions about evaluating field drainage before spring planting. Water always found the path of least resistance, flowing through soil according to composition and compaction patterns that were invisible to casual observation, but obvious to farmers who understood how ground conditions affected agricultural operations. The same principles would apply to mine installation, where German engineers would have encountered difficulties in areas where water accumulation prevented stable burial of explosive devices. He moved laterally along the mine barrier, feeling for subtle elevation changes that might indicate natural drainage channels. 20 feet to his left, he detected a slight depression, barely noticeable even, under moonlight, but significant enough to suggest water flow during rain events. The soil here felt different when compressed, slightly more yielding than surrounding areas, consistent with higher moisture content that would have complicated German engineering efforts. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Decker tested the ground with extreme caution, applying pressure gradually, while his mind processed feedback through nerve endings that had learned to distinguish between stable earth and disturbed soil. The depression extended approximately 4 feet in width, creating a corridor that was wider than previous gaps, but still required single-file passage and absolute precision from every soldier in the column. He led the rope through the final barrier, feeling Crawford's tension transmitted through their physical link as the sergeant realized they were now committed to the most dangerous phase of the infiltration. Behind Crawford, 148 soldiers moved with mechanical discipline, each man stepping exactly where the soldier ahead of him had stepped, trusting that Decker's navigation would sustain them through this last critical obstacle. The crossing through the final mine barrier took 12 minutes, each soldier moving with agonizing slowness, while German sentries remained focused on approaches they considered more likely than infantry infiltration through supposedly impassable terrain. The psychological advantage that defensive obstacles provided was now working entirely in favor of the attackers, creating complacency that allowed 150 Americans to advance to within 50 yards of German positions without triggering any defensive response. Private Hensley emerged from the minefield at exactly midnight, 2100 hours after Decker had taken his first careful step into terrain that should have been absolutely impassable under darkness conditions. The Philadelphia native had survived through combination of discipline and faith in agricultural expertise that he would never have credited if someone had described the scenario during training. But results were undeniable. 150 soldiers had crossed 400 yards of densely mined ground without triggering a single explosive device, achieving infiltration that staff officers would later describe as tactically impossible. Captain Henderson had been monitoring the crossing through radio communications with Sergeant Crawford, receiving periodic updates that confirmed steady progress through obstacles that conventional wisdom said could not be navigated without engineer support and daylight operations. The captain's initial skepticism had transformed into professional admiration for skills that operated outside military doctrine, but delivered results that formal training could not match. At 12:05 hours, Henderson gave the signal to commence assault operations against the German pillboxes. The attack came from a direction the defenders had not anticipated, launched by soldiers who had somehow materialized inside the defensive perimeter that mines were supposed to make absolutely secure. The psychological shock was immediate and devastating. German troops who had been confident in their defensive preparations suddenly found themselves engaged at close range by American infantry who should not have been able to reach their positions. The firefight that followed was brief and decisive. American soldiers who had spent the previous 2 hours navigating through minefields in darkness were operating with adrenaline-fueled intensity that overwhelmed defenders, still processing the impossibility of their tactical situation. The pillboxes that had anchored German defences throughout the afternoon fell within 30 minutes, their crews either killed or captured by infantry who had achieved what Staff College instructors said could not be done. German artillery fire began falling at 12:45, delayed by confusion among defensive commanders who could not understand how American forces had penetrated mine barriers without triggering the explosive devices that were supposed to provide early warning of infiltration attempts. The barrage fell on empty ground behind the American assault force, inflicting no casualties while consuming ammunition that German logistics could not easily replace. By 0100 hours on October 15th, the 2nd Battalion had secured the high ground beyond the former German defensive line, establishing positions that commanded the terrain features necessary for continuation of the 28th Division's broader offensive operations. The tactical success rippled through American command structures as staff officers recognized that one farm kid's agricultural expertise had accomplished what conventional military methodology had failed to achieve throughout an entire afternoon of costly assaults. Decker sat in a captured German bunker at 0130, drinking coffee that had been abandoned by defenders who fled rather than face American infantry who had appeared inside supposedly secure positions. Sergeant Crawford joined him, carrying his own cup and wearing expression that combined exhaustion with professional respect for competence that transcended formal training. "How did you know?" Crawford asked, gesturing toward the minefield they had crossed. "How did you know where to step, where the gaps were, how to navigate through all that in complete darkness?" Decker considered the question with the same methodical analysis he had applied to navigation decisions throughout the crossing. Agricultural skills were difficult to explain to people who had not grown up working land that required constant evaluation of soil conditions, drainage patterns, and terrain features that dictated practical operations. Military training emphasized technology and standardized procedures, while farming taught improvisation based on empirical observation and accumulated experience. "It's like walking your own fields at night," he finally answered. "You learn to read the ground through your feet, to feel differences that you can't see. Disturbed earth feels different from natural soil. Water drainage creates patterns that affect where things can be buried. German engineers were good, but they were working with the same limitations farmers deal with: wet ground, poor drainage, natural obstacles that prevent ideal placement. You just have to know what to look for." Crawford nodded, though Decker suspected the sergeant did not fully understand the agricultural principles that had guided their navigation. But understanding was less important than results, and the results were undeniable. 150 soldiers had crossed supposedly impassable terrain without casualties, achieving tactical surprise that had turned German defensive advantages into vulnerabilities. Captain Henderson arrived at 0200 hours, conducting his post-action assessment with the professional thoroughness that had made him an effective company commander despite limited combat experience. His questions focused on reproducibility and doctrine development, whether Decker's navigational methodology could be taught to other soldiers or incorporated into standard mine-clearing procedures. Decker was honest in his assessment. The skills he had used were agricultural rather than military, developed through years of practical experience that could not be compressed into training courses or technical manuals. Other farm kids might possess similar capabilities, but city soldiers who had never worked land would struggle to develop the tactile sensitivity and spatial awareness that the navigation had required. The technique was effective but not scalable, useful for specific circumstances but unsuitable for incorporation into standard operating procedures. Henderson accepted this limitation with pragmatic understanding. Military doctrine emphasized reproducible solutions that could be implemented by average soldiers with standard training, but warfare sometimes required exceptional individuals with unique skill sets that fell outside conventional frameworks. Decker's agricultural expertise had solved a tactical problem that engineering equipment and formal training could not address, providing value that justified deviation from established procedures. The strategic consequences of the successful crossing became apparent over the following days as the 28th Division exploited the breakthrough that Decker's navigation had enabled. German defensive lines that had seemed impenetrable when protected by extensive minefields collapsed rapidly once American forces demonstrated ability to circumvent obstacles through unconventional methodologies. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate, tactical gains, forcing German commanders to reconsider assumptions about defensive barriers that had been considered absolutely reliable. Intelligence reports captured from German units revealed the extent of enemy confusion about American mine-clearing capabilities. German defensive planners had assumed that minefield penetration required extensive engineer support, daylight operations, and artillery suppression that would provide advance warning of American assault preparations. The successful night infiltration violated every assumption that had guided German defensive planning, creating doubt about other supposedly secure positions throughout the Siegfried Line's western approaches. The 28th Division's after-action reports documented the crossing with clinical precision, noting that 150 soldiers had navigated 400 yards of densely mined terrain without casualties or detection, achieving infiltration that conventional doctrine classified as tactically impossible. The report attributed success to innovative navigation techniques utilizing agricultural expertise, carefully avoiding language that might seem to criticize formal military training, while acknowledging that unconventional solutions had delivered results that standard procedures could not match. Decker received the Bronze Star for his role in the operation, awarded during a ceremony that Henderson organized 3 weeks after the crossing. The citation praised his exceptional navigational skill and dedication to duty under extreme combat conditions. Formal military language that could not quite capture what the farm kid had actually accomplished. Agricultural expertise translated to military success in ways that defied conventional categorization, demonstrating that valuable skills sometimes came from sources that staff colleges never considered. The medal itself meant less to Decker than the knowledge that his navigation had saved lives. 150 soldiers had survived what should have been a catastrophic minefield crossing, returning to their families after the war ended because agricultural skills had provided safe passage through terrain that conventional military wisdom said was impassable. The human cost of warfare was measured in lives saved as much as objectives achieved, and Decker's contribution belonged in both categories. Private Hensley wrote home about the experience 6 weeks after the crossing, his letter carefully censored to remove tactical details that might compromise operational security, but preserving the essential human story. He described following a farm kid through a minefield in complete darkness, trusting agricultural expertise that seemed like rural mysticism to someone from Philadelphia. The letter expressed gratitude for survival and admiration for skills that city life had not prepared him to understand or appreciate. Sergeant Crawford incorporated the lessons into his leadership philosophy, recognizing that effective command sometimes required trusting soldiers whose expertise came from unconventional backgrounds. Military training provided baseline competence, but specialized skills developed through civilian experience could prove decisive in circumstances that formal education had not anticipated. The key was identifying when conventional solutions would fail and recognizing which soldiers possessed the unique capabilities that specific situations required. The Hurtgen Forest Offensive continued through November and into December, consuming American infantry divisions in fighting that would later be recognized as some of the most difficult terrain combat in the European theater. The gains achieved through Decker's navigation proved temporary, as German forces committed fresh reserves to defensive operations that eventually stalled American advances, despite enormous casualties on both sides. But the tactical success of the minefield crossing persisted in military memory, as example of how unconventional thinking could overcome obstacles that defeated standard procedures. Staff officers studied the action in post-war analyses, examining whether agricultural expertise could be systematically identified and utilized in future operations. The consensus was mixed. Decker's skills were real and valuable, but they could not be easily replicated or incorporated into doctrine that emphasized standardized solutions over individual capabilities. Decker himself returned to Iowa after the war ended, resuming agricultural operations on the same farm, where he had developed the navigational skills that had saved 150 lives during a single October night. He rarely spoke about his military service, treating the minefield crossing as an unusual but not particularly remarkable application of techniques that any experienced farmer would understand. The disconnect between civilian agricultural expertise and military significance remained something he never quite reconciled. The farm kid who had volunteered for a suicide mission because he thought he could navigate through darkness using skills learned while guiding livestock became a quiet footnote in the vast documentation of World War II combat operations. His story appeared in unit histories and training materials, always described with clinical precision, that failed to capture the human dimension of what he had accomplished. 150 soldiers had trusted a 20-year-old farm kid with their lives, based on his claim that agricultural instincts could substitute for engineering equipment in navigating through densely mined terrain. That trust had been validated through results that formal military training said were impossible, demonstrating that valuable expertise sometimes came from sources that doctrine writers never considered. The rope that had connected Decker to Sergeant Crawford throughout the crossing was preserved in unit archives, coiled and labelled with documentation that explained its role in one of the most unusual successful infiltrations of the European campaign. Physical artifacts rarely captured the significance of the actions they represented, but the rope remained as tangible evidence that 150 men had followed a farm kid through 400 yards of minefields in complete darkness and survived because agricultural skills translated to military success in ways that no staff college had anticipated. Captain Henderson's tactical reports emphasized the importance of recognizing unconventional expertise and creating conditions where soldiers with specialized civilian skills could apply those capabilities to military problems. The formal military hierarchy emphasized standardization and reproducible solutions. But warfare consistently produced situations where unique individual capabilities provided advantages that doctrine could not match. Effective leadership required balancing systematic approaches with opportunistic utilization of exceptional skills that fell outside established frameworks. The German defensive positions that had seemed impenetrable when protected by extensive minefields became vulnerable once American forces demonstrated ability to circumvent obstacles through methodologies that violated enemy assumptions about assault requirements. The psychological dimension of defensive warfare depended heavily on attacker beliefs about what was possible, and Decker's successful navigation shattered those beliefs in ways that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Staff Sergeant William Crawford survived the war and pursued a military career that eventually led to senior non-commissioned officer positions, where he trained younger soldiers in combat leadership principles. His instruction always included discussion of the minefield crossing, emphasizing that effective soldiers recognized expertise regardless of its source and adapted tactics to leverage available capabilities, rather than insisting on standardized solutions that might not fit specific circumstances. The lessons of that October night in 1944 remained relevant decades later, as military organizations continued wrestling with tension between doctrine-driven standardization and tactical flexibility that recognized exceptional individual capabilities. Decker's agricultural expertise had solved a problem that conventional military training could not address, providing template for thinking about how specialized civilian skills might prove decisive in circumstances that formal education had not anticipated. Private First Class Thomas Decker, the farm kid from Iowa who navigated 150 soldiers through 400 yards of minefields using skills learned while guiding livestock through darkened pastures, died in 1998 at age 74. His obituary mentioned military service, but focused primarily on his agricultural accomplishments and community contributions. The minefield crossing rated a single sentence, insufficient space to capture what he had achieved, but consistent with his preference for understatement about military experiences that seemed unremarkable from agricultural perspective. The soldiers who had followed him through that darkness scattered across America after the war ended, carrying memories of the night when a farm kid's navigational instincts had saved their lives. Some maintained contact through veterans' organizations, occasionally gathering to commemorate experiences that civilians could not quite understand. The minefield crossing remained their most frequently discussed shared memory, the moment when conventional military wisdom had failed and agricultural expertise had provided salvation through methodology that staff colleges never taught. The tactical impossibility that Decker had made possible through agricultural skills became a case study in military innovation literature, examined by analysts who sought to understand how unconventional thinking overcame obstacles that defeated standard procedures. But academic analysis could not quite capture the human reality of 150 men following a rope through complete darkness, trusting that a 20-year-old farm kid's claim about reading soil through boot soles would prove accurate enough to navigate them through terrain that should have been absolutely impassable. The mathematics had been brutal and simple. 400 yards of densely mined ground, one anti-personnel device per square yard, complete darkness that prevented visual navigation, and German sentries who would call down artillery fire the moment any mine detonation revealed American infiltration attempts. Conventional doctrine said the crossing was impossible without engineer support, daylight operations, and artillery suppression that would compromise tactical surprise. Decker had proven that agricultural expertise could substitute for military, Technology in circumstances where unconventional skills provided advantages that formal training could not match. The farm kid who had grown up navigating Iowa pastures in darkness had applied those same techniques to military navigation, demonstrating that valuable capabilities sometimes came from civilian backgrounds that bore no obvious relationship to combat requirements. The story of how one farm kid's impossible night navigation led 150 soldiers through a minefield remained precisely what it had always been, a testament to the reality that warfare consistently produced situations where exceptional individuals with unique skill sets accomplished what doctrine said could not be done. The human dimension of military operations could not be fully captured in technical manuals or standardized procedures because people brought capabilities and experiences that transcended formal training. Thomas Decker had volunteered for a mission that every tactical manual classified as suicide because he believed agricultural instincts developed through 20 years of farm work would translate to military survival. 150 soldiers had trusted that belief and survived what should have killed dozens of them. The validation came not through theoretical analysis, but through empirical results that could not be dismissed or explained away through conventional frameworks. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.